The first shock wasn't about the diploma. It was the way my husband smiled when his son asked me for $750,000. Not surprised, not hesitant, proud, like the money already belonged to them. I didn't understand that then. I understand it now. The folder slid across the restaurant table toward me with the kind of confidence that only comes from rehearsal. Clean pages, market projections, vendor estimates, a hand-drawn floor layout tucked neatly into the back sleeve. I sat there in that booth on a Thursday afternoon and watched my stepson sell me a dream so smoothly it almost felt unfair to doubt him. And the dangerous part was this: he was good. My name is Louiselle Sims. I am 61 years old, and I never finished high school. I left at 16 when my mother's kidneys started failing and somebody had to work because sickness does not pause rent, groceries, or light bills. I never went back to school after that. Life kept moving and I moved with it. What I built instead was experience, a catering supply company, rental properties, small investments that became larger ones because I learned how to read people before they finished speaking. Nobody handed me a blueprint. Women like me learn business by surviving bad decisions long enough to recognize good ones. Cornelius was 34. Odell's son from before our marriage. I'd watched that boy spend years drifting from one almost opportunity to another. Jobs that never lasted. Business ideas that disappeared by tax season. Promises that always sounded strongest right before they collapsed. Then something changed. Not overnight, gradually. He started dressing differently, showing up early, talking less, and listening more. About 2 years earlier, he began asking me real questions about vendors, leasing structures, overhead costs. Serious questions. The kind people ask when they're finally tired of pretending ambition alone is enough. I noticed. More importantly, I respected it. Looking back now, I think what fooled me wasn't intelligence. It was effort. For the first time, Cornelius looked like a man willing to stay inside uncomfortable work long enough to learn something from it. He still had rough edges, still talked bigger than he planned sometimes, but that no longer felt unusual to me. Plenty of successful people begin there. Sitting across from him in that booth, listening to him explain his banquet hall concept in downtown Birmingham, I remember thinking, maybe this is the first truly adult thing he's ever built. He knew the neighborhood demographics, parking flow, wedding demand, corporate event shortages on the South Side. He even brought competitor pricing sheets organized in a binder. Not perfect analysis either. That mattered to me too. One projection estimate felt slightly optimistic. One staffing assumption looked thinner than I would have planned myself. But those felt like normal mistakes from somebody still learning operations, not dishonesty. At one point, he looked directly at me and said, "I don't need a handout. I need a real partner who believes in this." That sentence reached somewhere deep in me, because belief matters to people who once had none. And maybe that's the real reason I trusted him. Not because he was Odell's son, because I recognized the hunger in him. I had carried that same hunger myself once. If you're listening to me right now, stay with me. Because this was the exact moment my life split into before and after. The next morning, I took the proposal to Elton Graves. Elton had managed my financial affairs for 22 years. Careful man, quiet man, the kind who reads every line twice before touching a pen. When I laid the proposal in front of him and told him Cornelius wanted $750,000 in startup capital, he didn't react immediately. He read, then reread, then leaned back in his chair and asked, "Does Odell know about this?" I told him he did. Elton nodded slowly after that. Not approval, calculation. Finally, he said, "If you move forward, we structure this properly." I trusted Elton enough not to argue. That trust saved me later. What I know now is that Elton spent the next several days building protections around me that I barely understood at the time. Ownership percentages, operational authority, governance clauses, things I signed believing they were procedural details instead of future weapons. 3 days later, paperwork was ready. Cornelius signed quickly. Too quickly, honestly. Elton offered him time to review the agreement independently. He declined, said he trusted family. I should have listened harder to the way Elton looked at him after that. The investment cleared on a Thursday afternoon. $750,000. The largest business transfer I had ever made in my life. I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the banking confirmation, while the sunlight moved slowly across the counter and felt something I had not felt in a very long time. Pride. Not in myself, in him. That feeling stayed with me through dinner that night, through Odell squeezing my shoulder when I told him the transfer was complete, through the quiet smile Cornelius sent me in the family group chat later that evening. I went to sleep believing I had helped build something important. I had no idea I had just paid for my own humiliation. Elton's office smelled the way it always had. Old wood, coffee, printer ink, and the quiet certainty of a room where serious things get handled carefully. I had sat across from that desk for more than 20 years. Property closings, refinancing agreements, commercial leases. Every major financial decision of my adult life had passed through that office at one point or another, and every single time I walked out feeling steadier than when I walked in. That morning felt no different. The paperwork sat in 2 organized stacks on Elton's desk. One prepared for me. One prepared for Cornelius. Cornelius arrived 10 minutes late, carrying enough energy for both of us. He apologized quickly, blamed traffic downtown, then sat down and immediately reached for the folder like a man impatient to touch the future. Elton noticed it too. He didn't react outwardly, but Elton notices everything. Before we started, he looked directly at Cornelius and said, "I want both of you to understand what you're signing today. If either of you wants independent legal review before execution, we stop here and schedule another meeting." That sentence matters now. At the time, it felt procedural. Cornelius laughed lightly and said, "I trust y'all." Then he opened the folder. Elton walked us through the operating agreement page by page in plain language. He always explained business the way intelligent people explain things, clearly enough that nobody feels embarrassed for asking questions. Ownership percentages, voting authority, operational control, member responsibilities. When he reached the equity section, he tapped the page with his pen. "Louiselle, because you're contributing the majority of the startup capital, your ownership interest will be 51%. I nodded. Then Elton added, "That also means major operational decisions require your authorization as majority member." Cornelius finally looked up fully at that, not alarmed, almost amused. He leaned back slightly and said, "Well, yeah, she's putting up the money. That makes sense." Elton held his gaze a moment longer before continuing. Cornelius kept nodding through the explanation after that. But I understand now what he thought he was agreeing to: investor protection, technical paperwork. The kind of structure banks and advisors like seeing attached to large money, not real authority, not the kind that could one day reach into the business and stop him. To me, 51% sounded symbolic too. A reflection of investment size, support, belief, not power. I signed where Elton indicated. Across the desk, Cornelius moved differently. Fast. Too fast. He skimmed instead of reading, flipped pages while Elton was still explaining sections. At one point, Elton stopped speaking entirely and waited because Cornelius had already turned 3 pages ahead. Cornelius smiled and said, "Sorry, I'm just excited. And honestly, I believed him. I watched his knee bouncing under the table throughout the meeting, his fingers tapping lightly against the folder. The restless energy of somebody convinced life was finally beginning to move in the direction he deserved. What I did not recognize then was another layer underneath that confidence. Assumption. The assumption that the details did not really matter because the money came from me, and I was safe, predictable, family. At one point, Elton asked him directly, "Are there any sections you'd like clarified before signing?" Cornelius barely looked up. "No, sir." Looks. Straightforward. Then he signed the entire agreement in under 3 minutes. I remember Elton watching him carefully after that. Not suspicious, exactly. Measured. Like a man quietly recording information he may need later. Afterward, we shook hands around the desk. Cornelius thanked Elton twice and started talking immediately about renovations, launch plans, booking projections, already mentally inside the future. Before we left, Elton looked at me for a brief moment longer than usual. He didn't say anything, but I know now that he was checking something. Maybe whether I understood what I had just signed. Maybe whether I understood the people sitting in that room with me. The drive home felt light, windows down, Birmingham rolling past in warm, late-morning sunlight. I remember stopping at a red light and smiling to myself because for the first time in years, I truly believed Cornelius had found his footing. I called Odell before I reached the interstate. He answered on the second ring. "How'd it go?" "It's done," I said. "Everything signed." There was a pause. Tiny. The kind you barely notice unless you've spent years listening closely to somebody. Then his voice warmed again. "Lou, I'm proud of you. You did a good thing today." I believed him completely. Why wouldn't I? By the time I got home, I felt almost peaceful. Like maybe all those years of helping, encouraging, carrying people financially and emotionally had finally produced something solid. Dinner that night was easy. Odell was attentive in a way that made me feel appreciated. We talked about the venue, possible opening dates, catering partnerships, Cornelius's growth over the years. At one point, Odell reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "It'll be good for him," he said quietly. I remember thinking, us, not him, us. I went upstairs before he did. Sometime later, half asleep in the dark, I heard his voice drifting down the hallway. Low, relaxed, not television noise, conversation. Then laughter. Easy laughter. The kind people use when they are fully themselves. And then I heard the name. Cornelius. I lay there staring into the dark and told myself fathers call their sons after good news. Families celebrate together. Men get excited. I told myself there was nothing strange about it. I almost believed that too. 10 days passed the way busy days do, in invoices, property calls, supplier orders, and the ordinary forward motion of a life that doesn't stop moving just because you're waiting on something. I wasn't worried. I was giving Cornelius space to build. That's what investors do. That's what I told myself. I drove past the venue on a Tuesday. The lights were on inside. I slowed down just enough to look through the glass front. Movement, people, what looked like furniture being arranged. I pulled back into traffic and thought, good. It's coming together. I didn't stop. I didn't call. I had my own businesses to tend. What I didn't know was that it had already opened. Odell's cousin hosted a small gathering that Saturday. Nothing formal, just family, food, the kind of afternoon that fills a living room with noise and old stories. I went because Odell asked me to. I wore something simple. I brought a dish. I was in a good mood. Cornelius was there, relaxed, laughing easy with the men near the back. I hadn't seen him since the signing. I crossed the room when I got the chance, touched his arm, told him the space had looked good from the outside when I passed. He smiled, said thanks, kept his body angled slightly away from me, just enough to notice, not enough to call out. Someone nearby asked him how the business was going. He straightened, came alive the way people do when they're proud of something, talked about the bookings, the layout, the response from the first event, present tense, past tense, like it was already in motion. I set my glass down on the table beside me. "When is the official opening?" I asked. My voice was even, calm. The question of a woman who simply hadn't heard the date yet. Cornelius looked at me. Something passed across his face, not quite a smile, not quite something else. Then he said it. "We did that 10 days ago." He paused just long enough for it to land. "It was for people with a diploma, at least." The room reacted before I could. A ripple of laughter moved through the people close enough to hear. Not all of them, but enough. I heard Odell's laugh, specifically. I knew it the way you know a sound you've heard 10,000 times. Easy, unbothered, like it was the most natural thing in the world. I stood in that room and felt something happen inside my chest that I will not try to dress up. It wasn't embarrassment. It was the specific pain of being reduced by someone you elevated, of being laughed at in a room full of people by the man you married and the boy you chose. I picked up my glass, set it back down, looked at Cornelius directly. "I want you to remember this moment," I said. "Everything about it." My voice did not shake. I made sure of that. I set my dish on the counter, said a quiet goodbye to the hostess, and walked out the front door. I drove 3 blocks, pulled into a gas station, put the car in park. Outside, a man was filling his tank. A woman walked out of the store with a plastic bag. Everything was ordinary. Everything was still moving the way the world moves when it doesn't know something just broke. I sat with my hands in my lap and stared through the windshield. I didn't cry. Not yet. I sat in that car for 11 minutes. I know because I watched the clock on the dashboard the way you watch something when your mind needs something neutral to hold on to. The gas station stayed busy around me. Cars pulling in and out. A teenager on a bicycle cutting through the lot. The world completely unbothered. I sat inside my own stillness and let the last 2 hours settle into their real shape. It wasn't the diploma line that broke something open. It was the laugh. Odell's laugh. I have known that laugh for 11 years. I know the version he uses for company. Controlled, warm, designed to make people comfortable. What I heard in that room was different. It was the laugh of a man who had been holding something back for a long time and had just been given permission to let it out. Easy. Loose. Like he had waited for that moment and recognized it when it came. I sat in the car and let myself go back. Not to one memory. To all of them at once. The time I mentioned a property deal at dinner and he changed the subject so smoothly I didn't notice until I was washing dishes. The way he sometimes looked at me when I was talking to someone in my industry. Not proud, something else. Something I always talked myself out of naming. The small comments over the years. Nothing loud enough to confront. Everything small enough to excuse. I had excused all of it because I loved him and because I had spent my whole life making things work. Sitting in that parking lot, I understood that I had been making something work that was never built to last. I picked up my phone. I didn't call to plan anything. I called because I needed to hear one voice. The voice of a person who had sat across from me for 22 years and never once made me feel like I was less than what I was. Elton picked up on the second ring. I told him what happened. Not all of it, just the facts, the gathering, the question, the answer Cornelius gave, the room laughing. I kept my voice flat. and even because that was all I had left in me right then. Elton was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that isn't empty. It's thinking. Then he said, "Come in Monday morning." That was all. I said, "All right." We hung up. I drove home. Odell was in the kitchen when I walked in. He looked up and said he'd saved me a plate. His face was relaxed, normal, the face of a man who had done nothing wrong by his own measure. I said thank you. I sat at the table. He set the plate in front of me and we talked about nothing. Something on television, the weather turning. I passed him the salt when he reached for it and held my face exactly where it needed to be. That performance cost me something I don't have a word for. I went to bed before him, lay on my side of the mattress and stared at the ceiling while he moved around the house like a man with a clear conscience. My mind didn't go to anger, it went to numbers. 11 years of figures I had never once laid out in a line. Properties, accounts, expenses I had covered without question. Something in me, the part that built everything I have from nothing, was adding it all up. I didn't have the full picture yet, but I knew who did. The folder was already waiting when I walked into Elton's office, not sitting off to the side, not stacked with other paperwork. Center of the desk, thick enough to bow slightly in the middle from the weight of what was inside it. Elton stood near the window with a cup of coffee in one hand. He turned when he heard me come in, nodded once toward the chair across from him, and sat down without offering small talk. That told me enough. I looked at the tabs lining the edge of the folder, dates, account summaries, property records, clean labels in Elton's careful handwriting. "How long did it take you to put this together?" I asked. He took a sip of coffee before answering. "Most of it was already documented." I frowned slightly. "Already?" "Louiselle, I've handled your accounts for 22 years. I document everything connected to your businesses. That's my job." That mattered. The way he said it. Calm. Practical. Not like a man unveiling some secret investigation, like a professional explaining routine procedure. He opened the folder from the beginning. Not Saturday, not the gathering, the operating agreement. He laid the copy flat between us and tapped one paragraph with his finger. "This is the clause I needed you to understand." He explained it slowly, in plain language, the same way he always did when something mattered. 51% ownership, majority member authority, access rights to the accounts, power to call a formal member meeting, power to remove the managing member if necessary. I listened without interrupting. Then he said, "You were never a silent investor, Louiselle. I wouldn't have allowed that structure with this kind of money involved." That sentence settled differently than everything else, because suddenly I understood something I hadn't understood when I signed those papers. 51% was not symbolic. It was control. The number had felt generous when I signed it, maternal almost, like supporting family. Sitting there in Elton's office, it felt like something else entirely. Protection. And honestly, that realization scared me a little too, because once Elton finished explaining the authority attached to my ownership, the next question came immediately behind it. If I exercise that kind of control? I stopped there briefly. "What happens to the business?" Elton answered without hesitation. "That depends on how carefully it's handled." That steadied me more than reassurance would have. He wasn't promising me victory. He was explaining responsibility. He turned to the second section of the folder. 11 years. Withdrawals. Transfers. Vehicle payments. Renovation costs. Money moved to Cornelius over the years, in amounts small enough to pass as family support until you saw all the numbers together. Nothing illegal. Nothing hidden. That was the part that made it worse. Every transaction had gone through legitimate channels. Approved accounts. traceable records. But once Elton laid them side by side in a single timeline, the pattern became impossible not to see. I stared at the total at the bottom of the page for a long time. The room stayed quiet while I read. Finally, I asked, "Why didn't you ever say anything?" Elton leaned back slightly in his chair. "Because financial advisors don't step into marriages unless they're asked to." He paused. "I flagged irregular patterns more than once over the years. You always approve the transfers anyway." I thought about that, and he was right. I had approved them. Maybe not carefully, maybe emotionally. Maybe because loving someone makes you stop examining things you would question from anybody else. But I had approved them. "I thought I was helping family," I said quietly. "You were," Elton replied. "The problem is they started treating your help like income." That landed hard because it was true. I asked him the question that had been sitting inside me since the gas station parking lot. "Can I demand my money back?" He shook his head slowly. "No, not cleanly." Then he explained why. The $750,000 had been invested as equity capital into the business, not structured as a personal loan. Trying to force repayment immediately would trigger a legal dispute over ownership interests, operating control, and business valuation. Lengthy, expensive, uncertain. "But," he said carefully, tapping the agreement again, "what you already hold may be worth more than repayment." I looked down at the paperwork. For the first time since Saturday, something inside me shifted away from humiliation and toward clarity. Not revenge. Position. I looked back at Elton. "How long have you suspected this?" He held my gaze evenly. "I suspected Cornelius was careless. I suspected Odell benefited from your generosity more than you realized. But suspicion isn't evidence." He tapped the folder once. "Documentation is evidence." That answer mattered too, because it sounded real, not dramatic, not prophetic, just careful. I nodded once, closed the folder, and slid my copy of the agreement into my bag. When I got home, the house was empty. I sat at the kitchen table with the paperwork spread out in front of me and started reading from page 1. Every line, every clause, every word I had trusted somebody else to understand for me. 3 times that night, I stopped to look up terms on my phone: managing authority, member action, fiduciary duty. By the time midnight came, I understood something I should have understood the day I signed it. I was not the woman who gave Cornelius a business. I was the woman who owned one. 4 days had passed since the gathering. I knew exactly how many because I had started paying attention differently after that night. Once disrespect finally shows itself clearly, your entire memory begins reorganizing itself around it. Things you ignored suddenly stand up and introduce themselves properly. Tuesday morning, Odell brought me coffee without being asked. Not unusual by itself, but Odell was not naturally attentive in small domestic ways unless something had shifted emotionally or strategically. That was the part I had started recognizing. He set the mug on the side table beside me while I reviewed invoices at the kitchen counter. "Thought you could use it?" he said. Then he went back toward the bedroom. I stared at the cup for a moment before picking it up. Wednesday, he asked about the commercial property I'd been negotiating on the east side for nearly 3 months. Asked follow-up questions too. Real ones. Financing structure, renovation projections, occupancy estimates. That caught my attention because Odell had spent years half listening whenever I discussed business, unless the conversation directly benefited him somehow. That evening, he suggested dinner. "Your choice," he said. I picked a steakhouse downtown I liked, but rarely suggested because Odell usually complained about the pricing. That night, he didn't complain once. He smiled through the entire meal. touched my hand twice while talking, asked if I was sleeping all right. I watched all of it carefully, not emotionally, structurally. The way I watch vendors who suddenly become extremely responsive right before contract renewal season. The warmth had timing attached to it now, intent attached to it. Something had changed in what they understood about me. I did not know yet whether Cornelius had finally gone back and read the operating agreement carefully, or whether Odell had started asking questions after the gathering. But I knew this much. The behavior was not random. Thursday morning, Cornelius called. His voice sounded relaxed, friendly, easy. The version of himself he used when he wanted somebody open and receptive. He invited me to see the venue in person, said he wanted my opinion on a few operational things, said he wanted me to finally experience what the space had become. I agreed to come that afternoon. And honestly, part of me still wanted to be proud of him. The venue was beautiful. I'll give him that without hesitation. Tall ceilings, warm lighting, clean lines. The kind of room that immediately makes people picture weddings, anniversary dinners, expensive table settings, soft music drifting through conversation. Cornelius walked me through the property with genuine pride, and he should have been proud. The vision itself was real. I asked questions as we moved through the space: booking numbers, vendor structures, staffing ratios, weekend projections. He answered everything openly because he thought I was admiring the business. What I was actually doing was reading it. There's a rhythm every operation develops when it's functioning properly. Staffing flow, vendor organization, communication patterns, timing between moving pieces. I learned years ago that businesses breathe. You can hear strain before collapse if you know what to listen for. The bookings were strong. That part was obvious. But the staffing looked thinner than it should have for that level of activity. Too much responsibility sitting on too few people. Employees multitasking beyond. Efficiency into exhaustion. Near the back hallway, an office assistant stood beside an open filing drawer sorting invoices, while another employee searched through a stack of folders nearby. As Cornelius kept talking beside me, I noticed the assistant pause over one invoice and say quietly, almost distracted, "This one was supposed to go under operations, right?" The other employee glanced over briefly. "No, that's the truck one. Accounting already moved it." Neither of them looked at me. Neither lowered their voices dramatically. It wasn't some shocking confession whispered into silence. It sounded routine, the kind of correction staff make 100 times during busy workdays without realizing who's nearby. But mentally, I filed the moment away. That is one thing survival teaches women like me. Never waste information just because you do not yet understand where it fits. Cornelius walked me to my car afterward. He thanked me for believing in him, said seeing me there meant a lot. Then he asked, carefully casual, "So, what do you think?" I looked back at the building. "The space is exactly what you described that day at the restaurant," I said. I watched relief loosen his shoulders immediately after I said it. Interesting. On the drive home, I realized something quietly important. Cornelius wanted approval more than partnership. Odell was sitting in the living room when I got back, television on low, comfortable, relaxed. "How'd it look?" he asked. "Good," I said. He smiled at that answer too quickly. We sat there for nearly an hour, watching television like a completely ordinary couple, with absolutely nothing moving underneath the surface. After he went upstairs to bed, I stayed in the kitchen. The house was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator. I picked up my phone and called Elton. "I need formal review access to the business accounts," I said. "Full records." There was a short pause. Then Elton asked, "As majority owner?" "Yes." Another pause. Not hesitation. Procedure. "I'll start the request process tomorrow," he said. "It may take a few days." That answer reassured me more than immediate access would have, because real systems move carefully. I hung up and sat there alone in my kitchen for a long time afterward, surrounded by things I had built with my own hands, my own judgment, my own endurance. And for the first time since the gathering, I felt something steadier than hurt. I felt prepared. The file came through at 7:43 in the morning. I know because I had already been sitting at the kitchen table for nearly half an hour, staring at a cup of coffee that had gone cold before I touched it. When my phone lit up with Elton's message, I put on my reading glasses, opened my legal pad to a clean page, and downloaded the files. 3 attachments: account summaries, vendor reports, expense reconciliation. I told myself I was prepared. I wasn't. Not because the information shocked me, because it confirmed something I had been trying not to name since that Saturday gathering. There is a particular kind of anger that comes when your instincts finally receive paperwork. When what hurt emotionally suddenly develops timestamps, account numbers, and transaction histories. The first thing I noticed was how sloppy it all was. Not criminal mastermind sloppy, comfortable sloppy. The kind people become when they stop believing anyone is watching. A vehicle lease paid through the operating account. Not a business vehicle. Cornelius's personal SUV, registered in his own name. Restaurant charges from places I recognized immediately because Odell liked them. Weekend travel expenses categorized as vendor outreach, even though one of the dates lined up exactly with a fishing trip Cornelius had bragged about over dinner 2 months earlier. Small things individually. But together, a pattern. I kept reading. Personal purchases pushed through under supply costs. Duplicate reimbursements. Entertainment charges with no client records attached. Nothing catastrophic enough to collapse the business overnight. That almost made it worse. They had not treated the company like something valuable. They had treated it like a wallet that would keep refilling itself because my money sat underneath it. My $750,000. Keeping 2 grown men comfortable while they laughed at me in public. At 8 o'clock, I called Elton. He answered immediately, like he'd been expecting it. I saw the flagged items, I said. I assumed you would. His voice stayed calm, professional, no drama in it. I asked him plainly what I was looking at. There was a brief pause before he answered. Potential misappropriation of company funds. Potential? That word mattered. It sounded real, not exaggerated, not theatrical. Careful. He explained it slowly. The business was new, which meant bookkeeping errors and improper expense handling could still be corrected if addressed early. But repeated personal spending through operating accounts without majority member approval created exposure, especially because the capital structure placed me as controlling owner. You're not looking at a criminal case, Elton said carefully. You're looking at a governance problem, one that's legally significant if it continues. That grounded it. I wrote the phrase, governance problem, across the top of my legal pad. Then Elton said, there's another issue. He walked me through a second set of records, not the business this time, but my marriage. 11 years spread across pages. The renovation from year 5. The truck Odell insisted he needed but never fully paid toward. The repeated transfers to Cornelius over the years, always framed as temporary help. Emergency support, short-term loans, family things. That was how it happened. Not all at once. Nobody drains you in one dramatic moment if they're smart. They do it gradually enough that each individual sacrifice feels reasonable while the total becomes invisible. Until somebody lays every number side by side. I added the figures myself, slowly, line by line. The way my mother taught me when I was a girl sitting beside her at the kitchen counter with grocery receipts and overdue bills. Double-check the math before moving on. By the time I reached the bottom of the page, the number sitting there no longer felt financial. It felt personal. I turned the legal pad over and stared out the kitchen window. Outside, a bird was pecking at something in the yard, like nothing in the world had shifted. I sat there for a long time with both hands flat against the table, not crying. I was finished crying about people who had mistaken my generosity for ignorance. Around noon, I picked up my phone again. Not Elton this time. 3 years earlier, a woman at an industry luncheon had slipped me a business card after overhearing a conversation about divorce settlements. She had smiled when she handed it over and said the words women say to each other when they've lived long enough to know better. Keep this, just in case. I had kept it. I found the card in my contacts and made the call. The receptionist answered. Calm voice, efficient. I said I needed a consultation. Earliest available. Tuesday morning, 9 o'clock. I took it. I did not tell Odell. That night, he sat beside me on the couch talking about something on television while I nodded at the right moments and watched him differently than I ever had before. Not emotionally, structurally. At 10 o'clock, I went upstairs, turned off the bedroom light, and closed my eyes. For the first time in days, my mind stopped racing. Not because things were fixed, because finally I understood exactly what was broken. I dress the way I dress when something matters. Not for the room, for myself. There is a version of me that shows up when I put on the right clothes and stand straight in the mirror. And that was the version I needed walking through a stranger's door that morning. Odell was in the kitchen when I came downstairs. I told him I had a property showing on the east side. He nodded without looking up from his phone. Didn't ask the address. Didn't ask the time. 11 years of marriage, and he still didn't know that I always know which properties I'm showing and when. I drove across town with the folder on the passenger seat. The attorney's office was on the second floor of a building on the north side of downtown Birmingham. Small, waiting area. Quiet. The kind of office where serious things get handled without announcement. The attorney came out to meet me herself, a composed woman, measured in the way people get when they have sat across from enough pain to stop being surprised by it. We shook hands. I followed her in and sat down. I put the folder on her desk. Told her I needed to understand where I stood. She opened it without ceremony and began to read. The consultation took just over an hour. She walked me through Alabama's equitable distribution framework in plain language, the same way Elton always talked to me, without making me feel like I was missing something. What I had built before the marriage was mine. My real estate portfolio, my catering supply business, my accounts established before Odell. Protected. She used that word more than once. The documented withdrawals were a different matter. She read through Elton's records slowly, cross-referencing dates. When she looked up, she said those figures represented what the law called dissipation of marital assets. One spouse depleting shared resources for personal benefit. She said a Birmingham judge reviewing 11 years of documented withdrawals against zero documentable contribution from the other party would have a very clear picture. I asked her what Odell likely expected. She leaned back slightly, said men in his position usually counted on exhaustion, on a woman who had too much to protect and too little energy to fight. They came to the table expecting to negotiate something out of sentiment or conflict avoidance. She tapped the folder. He doesn't know this exists. I told her he didn't. She said, then he's going to be unprepared. I signed the engagement letter before I left. She said she would begin preparing the filing. I told her I needed a specific date to remain open. She wrote it in her calendar without asking why. I sat in my car outside her building for a few minutes. Not grieving, not angry. There was something moving through me that I hadn't felt in a long time. The particular quiet that comes when you have been carrying a wrong diagnosis for years, and someone finally looks at the real results and tells you exactly what you're dealing with. I didn't celebrate. I just sat there and breathed until my chest felt like my own again. Then I drove home. Odell was making dinner, something on the stove, his back to the door. He turned when he heard me and smiled. Easy, warm, the performance so practiced by now it probably felt natural to him. I set my bag down on the chair by the door, watched him move around my kitchen, reach for my pots, stand comfortable in my house. I thought one word: Friday. I had made the reservation 3 weeks before any of this started. A restaurant Odell liked on the south side, good lighting, heavy menus, the kind of place that makes a regular evening feel considered. I had written the card myself, picked it out on a Tuesday afternoon when I still believed I was married to someone who deserved the effort. I did not cancel. I did not change a single detail. I dressed carefully. Not the way I dressed for the attorney. That was armor. This was something else. This was the performance of a woman who had decided that the last thing these two men would see coming was stillness. We drove together. Odell was in a good mood, relaxed, talkative, the version of himself he put on when he felt secure. He talked about a friend's new project on the way over. I asked questions, nodded at the right moments. When we pulled into the lot, he touched my hand briefly, and I let him. Cornelius was already at the table when we arrived. He stood to greet me, warm, easy, the posture of a man who had decided we were past whatever happened at that gathering. He looked comfortable, settled, the way a person looks when they believe the difficult part is behind them. We ordered. The conversation moved the way birthday dinners move. Stories, plans, laughter at old things. Odell talked about the year ahead, what he wanted to do, places he mentioned we should go. I raised my glass when the moment called for it. I smiled when the table smiled. Anyone in that restaurant watching our table would have seen a family celebrating. Cornelius brought up the business midway through the meal. Bookings were strong. He had a projections meeting scheduled. He was looking at expanding the catering partnership side of the operation. He said it with the confidence of a man holding something solid. I asked him about the vendor he'd brought on for linen and table service. Casual, curious. He told me the arrangement, the pricing structure, the terms. I already knew most of it. Over the previous week, Elton had started gathering records connected to the account review process I'd authorized. Not full operational access yet. That part still moved slowly through formal channels. But enough. Documentation had already come back to show patterns. What I was measuring now was the distance between what Cornelius said and what the paperwork suggested. He landed close enough on the pricing, but softened the payment structure slightly in his favor. Small. The kind of adjustment a person makes without thinking when they don't believe they're being checked carefully. I nodded. Said it sounded like a solid arrangement. Moved on. He had no idea he had just been tested. He had no idea he failed. We drove home just after 9. Odell was still talking, comfortable the way people are when a good evening is winding down. I changed clothes when we got in, put on something soft. Went to the kitchen and sat at the table while he settled in front of the television down the hall. I could hear it from where I sat, some program with a loud audience. I looked at the clock on the microwave. 9:44 p.m. I picked up my phone, pulled up Elton's number. He had not spent the week preparing some dramatic overnight takeover. Real systems do not move like that. What he had done was begin the formal groundwork carefully and quietly over several days. Document review requests, governance language. Procedural notices drafted, but not yet filed. An interim operations consultant identified in case escalation became necessary later. Everything positioned, nothing rushed. Tuesday, when I told him I needed a certain date kept open, he wrote it in his calendar without asking why. By Thursday, he had begun preparing the formal member meeting documentation required under the operating agreement. By Friday, the review requests were already moving through proper channels. Slowly, legally, carefully. That mattered to me now. Because the more I learned about systems, the more I understood that power rarely announces itself loudly when it's real. I pressed call. He answered before the second ring. I could hear paper moving softly in the background. Not surprise. Preparation. I said 2 words. Now. Do it. After I hung up with Elton, I filled the kettle and put it on the stove. The ordinary sound of it settling onto the burner calmed me more than I expected. I made tea slowly, stood at the counter while it steeped, then carried the cup to the kitchen table and sat down in the quiet. Down the hall, Odell's television program ended around 10. I heard the familiar rhythm afterward, cabinet doors closing, the bathroom faucet running, dresser drawers opening and shutting. The ordinary sounds of a man ending a completely ordinary day. The bedroom light went dark at 10:23. I checked my phone once. Nothing. I didn't expect anything yet. That mattered. Because real business transitions do not happen like movie scenes. Nobody presses a button and takes over a company overnight. There are procedures, notifications, delays, verification steps, people whose entire jobs exist to slow things down until documentation is confirmed. Elton understood that better than anyone I knew. I went upstairs at 11 and slept without difficulty. Saturday morning, he began the process formally. Not dramatically, formally. The emergency member meeting notice went out first. Time-stamped, documented, compliant with the operating agreement Cornelius had signed without reading carefully. Elton explained to me later that the language mattered. Every notice had to align exactly with the agreement structure, or a challenge attorney could attack the process itself later. By noon Saturday, copies had been delivered electronically and by certified mail. Then came the bank. That part moved slower. The operating agreement gave me authority as majority member, but authority still has to move through institutional verification. The bank requested additional ownership documentation, identity confirmations, meeting minutes, and written resolutions authorizing temporary review access to the business accounts. Temporary. That word irritated Cornelius immediately once he learned about it later, because it meant the bank had not frozen him out completely yet. But it also meant something more important. The institution was taking my authority seriously enough to begin restructuring access. Nothing changed overnight after that. That is important. No locks changed, no dramatic removal, no employees escorted out carrying boxes. The first week was mostly paperwork, calls, requests for clarification, and waiting for institutions to move at institutional speed. Saturday evening, Elton called me with an update. The bank flagged several expense categories for review, he said. That helps us. How much access do we have? Not operational control yet, but enough visibility to justify formal intervention if needed. That sounded real, grounded, messy in the way actual transitions are messy. Sunday morning, I went to church, 3rd row from the left. Same seat I'd occupied for 19 years. I sang when it was time to sing, listened when it was time to listen. During announcements, the woman beside me leaned over to show me a picture of her new grandbaby wearing a tiny blue suit. I smiled and told her he looked handsome because he did. The strange thing was how peaceful all of it felt. Nobody in that sanctuary knew lawyers were reviewing operating documents across town. Nobody knew bank officers were verifying ownership percentages tied to a banquet hall downtown. The world kept moving. That steadied me. By the middle of the following week, Elton began notifying major vendors that a governance review process was underway. pending verification of operational authority. Not termination notices, not threats, just formal communication. A few vendors responded immediately asking questions. One refused to discuss account adjustments without dual-member approval. Another requested direct legal confirmation before recognizing any management changes. Good. That actually reassured me. Resistance meant the process looked legitimate enough to take seriously. Nearly 10 days after my call to Elton, the first real operational shift finally happened. An interim operations consultant entered the business in a review capacity while the governance dispute continued moving through formal channels. Not to seize control. To evaluate workflow, expense handling, staffing structures, and vendor coordination while ownership authority was being clarified. At 6:30 that evening, Elton called again. "The staffing situation may get rough," he said. Meaning? Some employees are loyal to Cornelius personally. The consultant may walk into confusion. That was the first time I allowed myself to picture the situation clearly. Not revenge, disruption, staff arriving uncertain, phones ringing, vendors calling back. Cornelius realizing something had shifted beneath him legally before he fully understood how. Odell spent most of that Sunday in front of the television watching football. At one point, he made himself a plate from the leftovers in the refrigerator and asked if I wanted anything. I said I was fine. And I was. Not happy, not triumphant, just settled. Around 11:52 that night, my phone lit up where it sat beside me on the couch. Cornelius. I looked at the screen until the ringing stopped. Then again at 11:54. Then again at 11:58. 3 calls in 6 minutes. That told me more than words would have. Somewhere across Birmingham, Cornelius had finally walked into the first real wall of resistance. Maybe a vendor refusing authorization changes. Maybe the consultant reviewing expenses. Maybe the bank requesting additional documentation he did not expect. Whatever it was, panic had finally entered the room. I turned the phone face down on the cushion beside me and finished the page I was reading. Then I closed the book, turned off the lamp, and went upstairs. Whatever waited for him Monday morning would still be there when the sun came up. So would I. I knew what was happening across town without being there. I had walked that space. I knew the layout, which door the staff used in the morning, where the manager's desk sat relative to the entrance, how the light came through the front glass at that hour. I also knew enough by then not to imagine dramatic scenes that belonged in television. Nobody was storming the building. Nobody was throwing Cornelius out of his own office. The interim operations consultant Elton brought in was there in a review capacity first: documentation, workflow assessment, expense oversight, while the governance dispute continued moving through formal channels. Still, I knew what Cornelius would find when he walked in. A stranger sitting calmly behind a desk with paperwork already organized. Questions from staff that could no longer be brushed aside casually. Vendor calls waiting for clarification. The first visible sign that systems larger than personality had started moving around him. I made coffee at 7 and sat with it at the kitchen table. Odell had left earlier than usual, which told me something without telling me everything. I noted it, said nothing to no one. At 8, I was on the phone with a contractor about a property on the east side. At 8:45, I was reviewing a supply order that had come in overnight from one of my catering accounts. The work was ordinary and familiar, and I moved through it the way I had moved through every Monday for 25 years, with attention, without ceremony. My phone rang at 9:23. Cornelius. I watched the screen until it stopped, set the phone beside my keyboard, and went back to the supply order. He called again at 9:41. I let it ring. Odell called at 10:15. I let that ring too. But when his voicemail came through, I listened to it once. His voice was measured, too measured. the careful calm of a man constructing each word before he speaks it. He said he thought we should talk, said to call him when I had a moment. Said it like it was a small thing, like it was nothing. I deleted it. At 11:12, a text came through from Cornelius. I read it where it sat in the notification bar without opening it fully. You need to call me. This is serious. I picked up the phone, held it for a moment. I thought about a gas station 3 blocks from Odell's cousin's house. I thought about a room full of laughter and the specific sound of one laugh inside it. I thought about 11 minutes on a dashboard clock. Then I thought about something else. How quickly panic enters people once paperwork starts moving in directions they never expected. Not because they suddenly understand law, because institutions feel real in a way private disrespect never does. I put the phone in my bag. I finished my morning, closed out the supply order, returned 2 property calls, filed a lease renewal that had been sitting on my desk since Thursday. At 12:30, I drove to a cafe I had been going to for years. Corner table, good light, a waitress who knew my usual. I ordered something different today. Took my time with it. Sat with the particular quiet of a woman who is exactly where she is supposed to be. By mid-afternoon, the calls had slowed. 7 total from Cornelius. 2 more from Odell. 1 from a number I didn't recognize that I assumed belonged either to the consultant or somebody connected to the business review process. I let them all reach voicemail. Around 4:30, Elton sent a short update. The consultant had completed the first operational review meeting. A vendor had temporarily paused a delivery pending authorization clarification. Several expense records had already been flagged internally for additional documentation. Nothing explosive. That mattered. Real problems rarely arrive looking dramatic at first. They arrive looking administrative. At 6:15, when the day had settled and the panic on the other end had been given enough hours to move from shock into something more desperate, I picked up my phone and dialed. He answered on the first ring. I didn't speak immediately. I waited. Just a breath. Just enough. And even before he said a single word, I could hear it. His voice was shaking. I let the phone ring twice before I answered. Not to punish him. I just needed those 2 rings to settle myself completely, to make sure the woman picking up that call was not the same woman who had sat frozen in a gas station parking lot with humiliation climbing up her throat. I answered and said nothing. On the other end, I could hear movement. Voices somewhere behind him. A door shutting hard. Then Cornelius started talking. Fast. Sharp. Stepping over his own words. What did you do? Who is this man in my office? The bank said they're reviewing authority access now. Vendors are calling asking questions. Staff got some memo saying there's an operational transition. I let him keep going. That mattered too. Because panic tells the truth faster than anger does. He said the interim manager had no right to be there. Said staff were confused. Said one vendor had already paused a delivery pending clarification from ownership. Ownership. Interesting word for him to use now. Finally, he stopped long enough to breathe. I spoke calmly. No performance, no raised voice, no satisfaction in it. I told him the business operating agreement named me as majority member with controlling authority from the day the documents were signed. I reminded him that Elton had explained that structure in the conference room before either of us touched a pen. He tried interrupting. I kept speaking anyway. I explained that the bank review was triggered after repeated expense irregularities were identified inside the operating accounts. Personal vehicle payments, travel charges, miscategorized expenses. I told him no criminal accusations had been made, but as majority owner, I had both the legal right and fiduciary responsibility to intervene once those patterns appeared. That word slowed him down. Responsibility. Because suddenly this sounded less like revenge and more like governance, which was exactly what it was. For a few seconds, he said nothing. Then his voice changed. The panic pulled inward and hardened into anger. "You blindsided me." "No," I said quietly. "I read what you signed." Silence. Then, "This is my business." I looked down at the operating agreement sitting beside me on the kitchen table. "No," I said. "It's our business. You just never thought that mattered." That hit him harder than yelling would have. I could hear it. The breathing changed first. Then came the real thing underneath all of it. Not fear, offense. The genuine disbelief of a man who had never fully considered the possibility that the woman funding him might actually understand the structure holding everything together. He said, "Lower now." "I can't believe you do this over one joke." One joke. That almost made me laugh. Not because it was funny, because men like Cornelius always reduce the moment that exposed them. A room full of disrespect becomes a joke. Public humiliation becomes oversensitivity. Betrayal becomes misunderstanding. I leaned back in the chair. "Didn't I tell you to remember that moment?" The silence afterward stretched so long I thought the call had dropped, but I could still hear him breathing. Then movement on the other end. A muffled voice. The sound of the phone changing hands. Odell. The warmth was gone completely now. No careful husband voice, no softness layered over calculation, just flatness. The voice of a man who had finally realized numbers were no longer moving in his direction. "You're making a mistake," he said. I thought about that sentence carefully before answering, because the mistake had not started Monday morning. The mistake started years earlier when two men convinced themselves a woman without a diploma could build wealth, but not understand power. "No," I said softly. "I'm correcting one." That landed differently. I heard it in the silence afterward. Odell recovered first. "This isn't finished." I looked around my kitchen while he said it. My counters, my appliances. The property folders stacked neatly beside the wall calendar. The house I bought before he ever entered it. "You're right," I said. "It isn't." Then I ended the call. I set the phone face up on the table and sat there quietly while the house settled around me. I did not feel victorious. That surprised me a little. What I felt instead was exhaustion, deep and old. The kind that settles into a woman after carrying disrespect for so many years, she stops noticing the weight of it until somebody finally removes it from her hands. I sat there until that feeling slowly changed shape into something steadier. Not revenge, clarity. Eventually, I stood up, rinsed my coffee cup in the sink, and turned off the kitchen light. Then I walked through the house, checking locks the way I always did before bed. Back door, windows, stove, lights. Everything exactly where it belonged. Everything in my name. 3 days later, on a Thursday morning, somebody knocked on the front door. Odell answered it himself. I had a property showing at 10 that morning. Real, scheduled, already on my calendar before any of this began. A building on the west side I had been watching for 8 months. Good bones, right location. The kind of acquisition that requires patience. I showed up on time, walked every room, asked the questions I needed to ask. I was not hiding. I simply had work to do. When I came home just after noon, Odell was in the living room, sitting in the chair he always chose, the one closest to the window. The envelope was on the coffee table. He hadn't opened it, but he knew what it was. It sat between us like a thing that had already happened. I set my bag down, sat across from him. He started with the marriage. 11 years, he said. Everything we had been through together. The life they had built. His voice carried the tone of a man who had prepared what he was going to say and was now delivering it carefully. watching my face for the place where it would land. I let him finish completely. Then I told him what my attorney had told me, that everything I brought into this marriage was protected under Alabama law. My properties, my business, my accounts, established before he arrived, titled in my name throughout. That the financial records documenting 11 years of withdrawals had been classified as dissipation of marital assets. That his documentable contribution to the marriage, when measured against what had been extracted from it, left him in a very narrow position. I watched his face move through the information in stages. He got to the records and stopped. "What records?" he said. Not a question, a recalibration. I told him my advisor had maintained documentation on every significant financial movement tied to my accounts throughout the marriage. Every withdrawal, every transfer, every amount that left and didn't return. The change that moved across Odell's face in that moment was the most honest thing I had ever seen from him. The performance, the warmth, the calculation, the careful construction of 11 years, dissolved completely. What was left underneath was smaller than I expected. Just a man who had made a long bet on the wrong thing. He asked if we could handle it privately. No court, no public filing. His voice had lost its shape by then, the words coming out plain and tired. I considered it for a moment. Not because I owed him consideration, because I am not a woman who makes decisions from anger. I told him I would speak to my attorney. He nodded, got up, took the envelope down the hall to the guest room and closed the door. I sat in my kitchen for a long time after that. This kitchen that I had chosen, in this house that I had bought, with money I had made before he ever said my name. I thought about my mother, about the girl who had walked away from school at 16 with nothing but the decision to keep moving. I thought she would have understood every single thing I just did. My phone rang, my attorney. She said Cornelius had retained a lawyer, that a formal challenge to the business restructuring had been filed, built around the argument that he hadn't understood the terms he signed. I looked at the guest room door down the hall. "Let them," I said. The formal challenge arrived on a Tuesday morning. My attorney called me that afternoon while I was reviewing supplier invoices in my office. I closed the folder, leaned back in my chair, and listened while she walked me through the filing the same way she walked me through everything else, directly, clearly, without trying to soften reality into something easier to hold. Cornelius was contesting the restructuring authority, not emotionally, legally. That mattered. Because once lawyers get involved, feelings stop carrying weight unless paperwork can support them. She summarized the argument first. Cornelius claimed he had not fully understood the operating agreement when he signed it. Specifically, he argued he had not realized the 51% structure gave me unilateral authority over major operational decisions. I said nothing while she explained it. Then she added something important. They're not alleging fraud. That steadied me immediately. Fraud changes the temperature of a room. Misunderstanding is different. Harder to win. My attorney explained what his side would actually have to prove if they pushed the matter fully into court. That the agreement language was materially unclear. That he was denied reasonable opportunity for review. That he had been pressured or misled during execution. Then she paused briefly. "The problem for them," she said, "is documentation." I looked down at the copy of the agreement sitting open beside me on the desk. Every page initialed, every signature witnessed, every meeting time-stamped, and most importantly, Elton's notes from the signing meeting itself. Not dramatic notes, professional ones. Time started, terms explained, review opportunity offered, questions asked and answered, ordinary administrative details. The kind people ignore until those details become the only thing standing between losing and winning. Attorney continued. Elton's records show he specifically explained the majority member structure verbally before signatures were completed. Your stepson declined independent review and chose to proceed that same day. I thought about the speed with which Cornelius had flipped through those pages. The impatience, the confidence, the assumption that caution was unnecessary because the money came from me. What happens now? I asked. They can continue fighting, she said. But litigation costs money. Discovery costs money. And once financial records enter formal review, opposing counsel has to consider what else becomes visible. That was the first moment I understood something fully. The challenge itself was not really about ownership anymore. It was leverage, pressure, an attempt to force negotiation before things became more expensive and more public. I asked her what she needed from me. Nothing right now, she said. Go to work. Let me handle the legal side. So I did. 3 weeks passed. I moved through them the same way I have moved through every difficult season in my life, by staying in motion. Property calls, contractor meetings, vendor negotiations, lease reviews. A commercial building on the south side I'd been quietly pursuing for nearly a year. I did not sit around waiting for updates. Real businesswomen don't have time for emotional surveillance. What I allowed myself to know came through Elton in measured pieces. The venue was stabilizing. Not perfectly, stabilizing. A few employees quit after the restructuring. One vendor demanded revised contract language before continuing service. There were scheduling issues during the first week under the interim manager. Staff confusion. Delayed invoices. Normal transition problems. That realism mattered to me. Because smooth transitions belong in television shows. Real ones leave bruises. But by the third week, the numbers had started improving. Booking confirmations were up. Expense leakage had tightened. Vendor balances were cleaner. Event scheduling was being tracked properly instead of loosely managed through personal calls and text chains. The business was finally operating like a business. There was something painful in understanding that. Because Cornelius had built a beautiful space, he truly had. What he lacked was discipline, structure, respect for systems. He wanted ownership without governance, vision without accountability. And eventually, businesses punished that. The divorce moved on a separate track. Odell's attorney submitted an opening proposal the week after service. The number itself told me exactly what assumption they were operating under. That I would prioritize emotional closure over financial precision. My attorney corrected that assumption quickly. Every premarital asset was documented. Every withdrawal Elton had tracked over 11 years was laid out clearly. Vehicle purchases, renovations, transfers, support payments. The response package was not angry. That made it devastating. Odell took 4 days to sign the revised settlement. 4. I was walking through a commercial property the following Thursday when my attorney called again. High ceilings, strong foundation, good natural light coming through the front windows. The kind of building that tells you immediately whether it's worth your time. I stepped away from the realtor to answer. My attorney said Cornelius's legal challenge had been formally withdrawn that morning. Not dismissed. Withdrawn. That distinction mattered too. It meant his attorney likely advised him the fight was becoming expensive, difficult, and increasingly unwinnable. I thanked her calmly and ended the call. Then I turned back toward the building and continued the walkthrough like nothing had happened. Because by then, something had changed inside me. I no longer needed their panic to feel powerful. The divorce finalized the following week. Odell moved out on a Thursday afternoon. I watched his car disappear down the street from the front window of the house I bought years before he ever walked into it. Odell left on a Thursday afternoon. By Friday morning, the house already sounded different. Quieter. Not emotionally quieter, structurally quieter. One less set of footsteps, one less television running in another room, one less person opening cabinets that belonged to me. I woke up at 6:30, made coffee, cleared my desk, and reviewed the day's schedule. 8. Property call at 8. Supplier approvals by 10. A walkthrough that afternoon on a mixed-use building I'd been watching for almost 2 years. The day had shape to it. Forward motion. I trusted that more than feelings. The walkthrough was on the south side, commercial space downstairs, 4 residential units above, older brick structure, strong foundation, the kind of property most people drive past because they only know how to see what something is instead of what it could become. I walked every floor slowly beside the owner's representative, asked about maintenance records, tenant turnover, roof age, drainage history. At one point, the man stopped mid-conversation and asked, almost casually, "You in development yourself?" I said, "Real estate." He nodded once after that and started speaking to me differently. That stayed with me on the drive home. Not because he respected me. I'm used to respect now. Because he respected me before asking where I went to school. For years, I had been sitting in rooms pretending not to notice how often people searched for credentials before they searched for competence. The diploma question usually comes quietly. What university? What program? What background? I never had those answers. At 16, I left school to take care of my mother while her body failed one piece at a time. There was no inspiring speech attached to it. No grand sacrifice music playing in the background. Just bills, medication, work. And afterward, I kept working. Every property I bought started with uncertainty. Every business decision I made came from observation, discipline, and learning how to read people faster than they read me. That was my education. Attention. I thought about that later that month when the venue hosted a regional catering industry dinner. I almost didn't attend. Then I decided I would. The space belonged partly to me long before I fully understood what that ownership actually meant. Hiding from it would have felt smaller than I was willing to become. I arrived alone, checked my coat, walked into the ballroom while conversations rolled softly through the room and servers moved between tables carrying trays of drinks. The place looked beautiful, not flashy, controlled. The operations manager had stabilized things well. Staff moved efficiently, vendors were organized, lighting warm, timing smooth. Near the entrance, one of the regional suppliers recognized me and crossed the room to shake my hand. "I've been meaning to tell you," he said. "The restructuring saved this place." Not whispered, not hidden, said directly, in public. A few heads turned toward me after that. Then something happened that stayed with me longer than I expected. The supplier smiled and said, "Smart ownership changes are rare in this business." Ownership. He said it naturally, like it belonged to me. No jokes about diplomas. No careful little laughs meant to remind me where somebody thought I belonged. Just respect. Real respect. I thanked him calmly and took my seat near the center of the room. Halfway through dinner, I noticed Cornelius standing near the far side of the ballroom, speaking with one of the vendors. He looked over once. Just once. No dramatic confrontation followed, no scene. That would have ruined it. Because the real consequence was already sitting there in plain sight. The business was succeeding, without him controlling it. At no point that evening did anybody laugh at me. I noticed that fully. A week later, I met Essie Mae for dinner at a small restaurant on the north side we'd been visiting since the years when neither of us had enough money to order dessert without thinking first. She asked how I was doing. I told her the truth. tired, I said, but lighter. Essie Mae nodded like she understood the exact weight of both words. We talked about Birmingham, about getting older, about my mother, about the strange experience of building a life slowly enough that one day you wake up standing inside something people assume came easily. At some point during dinner, I laughed, fully this time, from somewhere deep enough that it surprised even me. Essie Mae looked across the table and smiled. "There you are," she said. I knew exactly what she meant. Driving home that night, I thought about all of it. A glass lowered onto a table, 11 minutes in a gas station parking lot, a folder waiting on Elton's desk, 2 words spoken quietly into a phone, "Now, do it." And finally, after all of it, I understood something those 2 men never did. I didn't need a diploma to recognize disrespect. And I certainly didn't need one to take back what belonged to me.